Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for part one of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion webinar series. This 8-part webinar series will feature 2 tracks this year. Sessions on the Tuesday track are aimed at building diversity, equity, and inclusion practices in your workplace and in the community. And sessions on the Thursday track are focused on highlighting diverse-owned businesses and entrepreneurs. This webinar series is presented by the Greater Wyoming Valley Chamber's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council and sponsored by PNC Bank. Before I introduce our presenting sponsor, I wanted to go over some housekeeping items. All attendees will be in listen-only mode. To be respectful of everyone's time, we have allotted time at the end for questions and answers. Feel free to ask a question at any time during the presentation by submitting them in the chat box. This event is being live streamed on Facebook. For anyone watching on Facebook, please enter your questions in the comment section and we'll ask on your behalf. A recording of this session will be available on our Facebook and YouTube pages by the end of the week and will be linked on the main event page for the webinar series. Now, to get us started, I want to thank our sponsor, PNC Bank, for again sponsoring our webinar series. We have a quick video from PNC Bank to show, and then we'll hear some remarks from John Rossetti before he introduces today's speaker.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of everyone at PNC, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. At PNC, we embrace and promote diversity and inclusion as a core element of our values and our culture. We recognize that it's bigger than any single person or group. When coupled with collaborative teams and inclusive leaders, there's far-reaching impact. Taking the time to join us today indicates that you are interested in learning about the roles and responsibilities necessary to create more opportunities for positive understanding and change. Thank you for showing up to prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion today. Also, a big thank you to the Greater Wyoming Valley Chamber for creating this series and to the phenomenal presenters for sharing their time and expertise to help foster a more inclusive culture in our community. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Alicia Nordstrom. Alicia is a professor of psychology at Misericordia University, and her research focuses on classroom interventions to reduce stereotypes and prejudice in college students. Alicia is the creator of the Voices Project, a stigma and discrimination reduction program that has been shown through research to reduce racism and mental health stigma. Voices Project Disability won the Electric City Diamond City Best Theatrical Performance Award, and the Voices Project Mental Health was performed at the Broadway Bound Theater Festival in New York City. Alicia is currently co-editing a book on stigma and discrimination reduction programs across the world, coming out this July. So with that being said, I will turn it over to you, Alicia.
Thank you, John, and thank you so much to the Chamber of Commerce for having me. I'm really happy to talk with all of you today. An hour doesn't seem like a lot of time to me, so I'm going to do my best to fit in what I can in the hour. If I go, I'm going to leave time for questions at the end. So I understand if anyone has a 1 o'clock appointment and you need to leave early, totally understand that. But if you want to hang out or chat or ask me questions at the end, I'm also going to give my contact information and my website at the end as well. All right. So what you need for this presentation, if you have something nearby that you could write on and write with, I'm going to give a little bit of time for some reflections, and I have prompts for everyone to do that. If I had more time, I could actually give you more time to do that. So if you want to come back and write more, I encourage you to do that. I know that this presentation will be archived. When I talk about diversity, I try and be really honest and blunt about what we're talking about. And so I'd love to encourage everyone to put your judgments aside and bring sort of a curiosity or an interest, because as a psychology professor, I'm going to be talking a little bit about how our minds work when it comes to stereotypes and prejudice. And so instead of being defensive or judgmental, let's just take some distance and examine what our thoughts are. And give yourself the courage to let yourself feel uncomfortable. Oftentimes when we feel uncomfortable, we try and leave the situation or distract ourselves. So if anything comes up for you today that makes you feel uncomfortable, that's actually a really good thing, because that means that something is happening in your mind, something that's making you change perspectives. So can you think of a time when you felt like you were misunderstood or devalued? This can be in the workplace, this could be in your personal life. So I'm going to give everyone a minute to think or write down what characteristics about you do you think played a role in how people were treating you in that situation? Did anyone stick up for you or advocate for you? And what emotions did you feel and how did you deal with them? So that's like a lot of questions, but I'm going to give everyone about a minute just to think that over and take some notes if you want to. So, so once again, because of time, I can't give everyone the amount of time I normally would if this was a longer in-person presentation. So I encourage you to go back and reflect on these questions. I'm not going to ask people to share, although if this was in person, I might have people do that in small groups or big groups. But I asked this question just to illustrate that we all have multiple parts of our identity. And any one of those parts of our identity might be misperceived or devalued or misunderstood by other people. So all of us at some point have experienced some kind of stereotypes or prejudice or discrimination, no matter who we are. So I'm going to go into a little bit of psychology when it comes to how do we understand what these things are, these terms that I'm using. So first, let's talk about what is a stereotype. So a stereotype is a generalization about a group of people in which certain traits are assigned to virtually all members of the group, regardless of the actual variation among the group members. So the simple way to think of this is stereotypes are ideas that we have about people that go from the word some to the word all. So if you have a stereotype in your mind, then your mind is saying all people in this group have this trait or characteristic. So I'm going to label some of the stereotypes that are floating out there in society that everyone is aware of. I didn't make these up. So I'll use, because I'm female, I'll use myself as an example. So all women are bad drivers. So that's an idea, right? It's like funny, people use it in comedy all the time. So the idea is that some women are bad drivers, sure, right? Some women are, but not all women are. And when you have a stereotype, your brain goes from understanding the word some to slapping the word all on top of that particular group. I'll also use a quote unquote positive stereotype. All Asians are good at math. So this is a stereotype that floats out there. So you might say, well, that's a positive thing. What's wrong with that? Well, one, Asia is a huge country, and now we're talking about or a continent. Hundreds of countries are in Asia. So it would never make sense, right? That every single person from the continent of Asia is good at math. Some people from Asia are good at math, but not all people from Asia are good at math. And it might seem ridiculous when we put it in those terms, but stereotypes truly are that way. So maybe one thing that I encourage everyone to do is to begin to notice, non-judgmentally, but notice when a stereotype might pop up for you and then kind of say, wait a minute, does that make sense that all people in this group would be this one particular way? And that's sort of the first step, is that awareness of catching those stereotypes when they happen. So what are the consequences of stereotypes? We might be like, well, I mean, they're stereotypes, like they're not a big deal. So stereotypes actually affect people's performance in different areas. So if you're someone who loves to read, I'm going to be sharing some different books. They're all like $10 on Amazon. So Claude Steele is a dean at Stanford University, and he is a social psychologist who labeled the idea of stereotype threat. And that's when members of a group are so aware of the stereotype about their group that they begin to accidentally confirm that stereotype. So it's kind of like the anxiety of knowing about the stereotype makes that stereotype actually start to happen. So I'm going to give you 2 examples from Claude Steele's research. So here we have the stereotype that men are better at math than women, or women aren't as good as math as men. So here we have a study where there was a condition where there was a stereotype threat, meaning that male and female students were given a math test. And in that math test, the instructions were, all right, everyone, here's a math test. And for the women out there, we just want you to try your best because we know that math is really hard, so just try your best. So what they're doing is invoking that stereotype and getting it to kind of, for people to really be aware of it. In the non-stereotype threat conditions, there wasn't any statement like that. It was just, here's a math test. And if you look at this graph, what we see is that the condition where the females received that stereotype threat actually underperformed, did half as well as men compared to the other condition where the performance was actually equal. The same thing is true with racial minorities and academics. So under the same type of conditions, Black students, when they didn't get any stereotype threat, performed just as good as white students. But when they were told to just do their best because they might find this test really difficult, the Black students performed half as well as white students. So these are just 2 examples. There's tons of other examples. This is also true in sports and athletics as well. So stereotype threat has real effects on people's performance. Stereotypes also can affect not just mental health, but physical health. So research on racism shows that people who are greatly affected by racism have a lot of different medical concerns and risks. So they're more likely to smoke, use over amounts of alcohol, and have problems with high blood pressure, heart attack, cardiovascular disease, as well as anxiety and depression. So we know that there's real consequences and effects for stereotypes, which means, you know, what can we do to try and help people not suffer from the effects of stereotypes? So some people out there, and maybe you're part of this group, you see yourself as a good person, right? We are all good people. And the idea that we might be biased doesn't take away from the fact that we are all good people and well-intentioned people. So once again, we're not going to judge the fact that we're biased. We just want to notice when we are biased and what are these biases and how are they affecting our success in what we do. And so the idea of color blindness, like I don't see color, I treat everyone equally, actually has negative effects for people that hold that mindset. So people who, quote, don't see color actually end up acting more racist and having less success in their future careers. And I think the goal isn't to see everyone the same. The goal is actually to notice everyone's difference. And we're going to be talking about that through this presentation. So we want to notice people's identity. We want to notice what makes them unique and special, and we want to embrace that. So that's the goal, not making everyone look the same. So I've talked a little bit about stereotypes. And I want to start to move into prejudice and discrimination. So what's the difference between those two things? So prejudice is a hostile or negative, and I bolded the word attitude or belief towards a person because they're a member of a particular group. So the word attitude means that it's a way of thinking that's negative about a particular group. So once again, to raise stereotypes that we've seen in the headlines, some members of groups are assumed to be criminals or drug dealers because they're a member of a particular group. So that would be prejudice, sort of this negative attitude that, oh my gosh, this person's really dangerous. Discrimination is a negative action. So discrimination would be actually acting or changing your behavior in response to the prejudice. So maybe we don't want to hire somebody that we perceive is part of a particular group. So in that case, we might actually be discriminating. Discrimination, right, means change, changing our actions or behaviors because we have prejudice towards a particular group. So that's kind of the difference. So when we put it all together, it's actually kind of a pathway. So stereotypes are sort of that broad way of thinking, right? All people in this group are criminals. Prejudice would be you add an emotion, a negative emotion into that thought. And then discrimination is now we've moved into action and acting on those things. So let me give you an example from mental health. So I'm going to ask you just in 30 seconds to write down what adjectives or phrases come to mind when you think of or hear the word schizophrenia. And we're going to revisit this later. All right, so hopefully you jotted down some phrases that come to mind when you hear schizophrenia. So in terms of mental health, here are some commonly known, according to research, things and ways that people think about and respond. So one stereotype about people that have mental health conditions is that they're dangerous. So there's kind of links to dangerous behavior in terms of harmful to other people. They might be perceived as not competent because of their mental health condition, or that they're very weak. Like, why can't they just overcome what they have? So those would be the stereotypes. In terms of prejudice, people might have negative emotional reactions. So if they think that someone has a mental health condition, they might be afraid of them. They might feel angry towards them. And the discrimination would be not hiring someone with a mental health condition or not giving them housing opportunities. So the reason why this pathway is important is that it's much easier to change things when it's at the level of a stereotype than it is if it gets further and further ingrained in terms of prejudice and discrimination. So that's why we want to take stereotypes seriously and start to catch them. And at the end of this presentation, I'm going to give everyone very practical suggestions of what are ways that we can try and change these things about ourselves. So one thing that's really tricky is that when I say to be aware and catch the stereotypes you might be thinking, sometimes this is really hard because some stereotypes kind of live underneath our awareness and are outside of sort of our level of consciousness. So in psychology, we call this automatic processing, ways that we think about the world that stereotypes might be activated even if we don't consciously know that they're being activated. So if you're really interested in this concept, I encourage you to Google Project Implicit. So Dr. Banaji is at Harvard University, and she designed something called the implicit association test. So if you Google Project Implicit or Implicit Association Test, you'll go to her website and you could actually take this test. And at the end of the slideshow, I have a podcast where she talks about the test, how she created it, how it works. And the idea behind the test is that it lets you know what biases you might have that you don't realize that you actually have. So it's not like an alarm goes off when you take this test. What it tells you is what types of preferences you have. So there's versions of this test for lots of different categories. So do you prefer whites versus blacks? Do you prefer Democrats versus Republicans? So do you prefer men versus women? So there's lots of different categories. And this is what you get is kind of this idea of what types of preferences that you have that maybe you don't know you have. And the thing I'll say about the implicit association test is that biases come out on this test, and even people that are in a particular group may have a bias against their own group. So for example, when blacks take this test, they tend to have a preference for whites, even though that's not their racial group. That's how embedded some of the stereotypes are, that even people within the same group might actually endorse a bias against their own group membership. So I encourage you to take that as kind of a really interesting reflection on what might your thoughts be that you don't even realize are there. So I want to shift for a second and kind of talk about, well, most of us don't think we're prejudiced, right? Once again, we're nice people. A lot of you I know are in jobs and careers where you're supporting and helping other people. So how does prejudice start? How does it work? And it has to do with some common ways that humans just think. And one ways that humans operate is that we tend to prefer people that are similar to us. So I'm going to call that an in-group. So people in your in-group are people that have a shared identity with you. So for me, that might be women. I might have more of a preference for women than men in certain situations. That could be your religious group. That could be your ethnic group. So it could be a lot of different things. And I have this sports picture. Sorry if you're an Eagles fan. I just threw the Steelers up there. So we know that in sports, fandom is a really big deal. So why is it that there's so much violence at sports events? It's like, just because I'm a Steelers fan and you're not, now I hate you. And now I'm going to actually be aggressive with you, even though I don't know anything about you, just because you're not in my in-group. So I use sports as kind of a way to examine how powerful prejudice can be, even when the stakes are so low. Really, does it matter who belongs to what sports team? That doesn't really affect your life in the way that some other parts of our identity are, but yet people react so strongly. So that means what happens with the outgroup. So the outgroup would be people who do not share your traits or your characteristics. And what happens is that when people are in the outgroup from us, we tend to think they're more similar than they actually are. And so we see this with people that are Asian, that people that are not Asian tend to think that all Asians are the same, regardless of the fact that they might come from totally different countries, speak totally different languages. So there's some dangers here. One is to notice when we might be having an in-group bias, when we might tend to prefer people that are similar to us. And two is to notice how we tend to overgeneralize people that are not like us in our outgroup. So I've laid out some complicated ways that we think that kind of feed into our biases. So what can we do to start to change some of these things? So I'm a college professor. I teach at Misericordia University. And I created the Voices Project a decade ago because I heard students talking about stereotypes that were actually leading them to act in a way that was discriminatory. And that made me concerned that I'm training in the classroom the next generation of leaders and teachers and healthcare professionals and business owners, but do they really understand how their biases are going to affect them? So that's why I developed the Voices Project, to help students begin to be aware of and break down their stereotypes. So the idea of the Voices Project is to put my students in direct contact with people that are different from them. So to break that in-group, out-group bias. And I drew upon what's called contact theory, which basically just says, if you put two people that are different in contact with one another under specific conditions, it tends to break down stereotypes and prejudice. So there's 50 years of research that supports this in many different ways. And this is true even in countries that have super high levels of ethnic conflict. So I drew upon that idea when I built the project. But the thing is that to put two people that are completely different and have negative attitudes towards each other in contact with one another, it has to be done in a particular way. So there has to be equal status among the group members. So you can't have like a boss and an employee, because then the power differential isn't the same. You need to create an opportunity where the power status is the same for both people. Give them common goals. So the idea of this is to have these two people working together on a collaborative, shared type of process where positive emotions can be a part of it, and where there's an opportunity to build a relationship or a friendship. So I used those principles and I developed this project. So my goal was to reduce, my students happen to be all white in this semester, so to reduce my students' prejudice towards social groups in society that tend to have a lot of stigma, meaning a lot of prejudice and discrimination. So I was teaching an intro to psych class for a semester. And so what I did was I found people in the community that crossed or were members of these 4 different groups. So I had multiple types of racial groups, social class, health conditions, and sexual orientation. So I had volunteers from the community from those different groups. And I was teaching 2 intro to psychology classes. So one class did the Voices Project assignment, and the other class, which I'm sort of, my research hat calls my control group, just did a 5-page term paper. And I wanted to see if there would be changes based on the students who did the Voices Project versus those that didn't. And to research that, I gave students surveys about their attitudes towards those different groups, the first week of the semester before the project, the last week of the semester after the project, and 1 year later. Okay, so here's how the Voices Project works. So I assign students to interview someone from the community in one of those groups, and I purposely assigned the students to interview someone that they had a negative attitude about. This did not go over very well. Students were not really excited or happy about this when I said, hey, guess what? You're going to interview a Muslim person, or you're going to interview a person with AIDS. They were sort of like, their stereotypes were going crazy. So they were like, what? So as an instructor, I had to do a lot of discussion and preparation for the students. But I'll tell you what happened after the interviews. So after the students were going to interview this person, and then the student was going to write a 5-page mini memoir or an autobiography about the life of the person they interviewed, but using the word I. So that was the way for my student to take over the identity of the person they interviewed and try and promote empathy and taking perspective of what their life was like. So after they wrote these stories, we had 30 of these stories. A faculty writing team and I took these stories and integrated it into a staged reading program. So sometimes we took what was similar across the stories and made that into a scene in the staged reading. And sometimes we highlighted what was unique about people's experience in those different groups. And finally, once we created that stage reading program, we performed it out at Misericordia so that these stories that were collected weren't just shared within the classroom, but were also shared to the campus and to the community. Many of the people who were interviewed came. and actually were able to watch their own story be represented. So I will say that after I talked about the anxiety of the students before they met their interviewee, after they met their interviewee, they came back to class and were like, my person was so nice. It was just like a regular person. And I was like, that's the goal, right? Is to break your stereotypes by realizing that this person that you're interviewing is just a human being with their own unique qualities, just like everybody else. So here is an example of like a little excerpt of one of the stories. So this was a white student that was interviewing a Black woman, and the Black woman reported this. She said, in first grade, we did a project in which we drew self-portraits. My class was predominantly white, so they all used orange crayons to color themselves. Since I was Black, I started coloring my face with a brown crayon. My teacher took my brown crayon from me, and I was forced to color myself orange. My parents knew exactly what was happening. They bought me a brand new set of crayons and had to sit down with the teacher. I didn't color for the rest of my childhood. So these words were written by a white student having interviewed a Black woman. So part of the Voices Project is also a storytelling social justice project where people can share the stories and challenges of other people to try and disseminate and educate people about different experiences. So when I looked at the research data that I collected, I found that students in the class that completed the Voices Project reported reductions in their stereotypes and racist attitudes towards the 4 racial groups compared to the students in the class that didn't. And those changes remain 1 year later. So that told me that this project was having a learning effect on the students. So I did the project again a few years later, but this time I focused on physical disability. And I partnered with the Center for Independent Living, which was in Scranton at the time. And I found volunteers with different physical health conditions. And these are some of them that were included. And my students did the same thing where they interviewed people with these different health conditions, wrote the memoirs. And then this time we were able to perform in WVIA studios and record the performance, the sharing of the stories. And that documentary is available on my website, and it was aired on WVIA and is now available for future viewing as well. So in terms of the disability, we did perform it also at Misericordia to an audience of 400 people. And as I said, that documentary aired on WVIA. In 2016, I did the Voices Project focused on mental health. So this time I had 50 undergraduate students interview people with mental health conditions. And you could see from this list that we tried to be very inclusive and include a lot of different conditions. People from the ages of 9 were interviewed to age 80 and everything in between. So once again, the students interviewed people, wrote stories. We turned the story this time into a theatrical performance that was memorized and had a cast of 21 people. Over 600 people attended the performance at Misericordia. Then I had the opportunity to bring it to the Broadway Bound Theater Festival in New York City, where it was directed and cast by professional actors. We also this time recorded 6 of the actual interviews between the person that was interviewed and the student. And that documentary was aired on WVIA. And hopefully, if time allows, I'll be able to show you a little clip of that later today. So just FYI, it's time for another Voices Project. So I'm currently right now working on building the Voices Project Immigration. It's going to focus on the stories of immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. The interviews will take place in the fall, and the theatrical production will take place in the spring. So if anyone out there wants to get involved, let me know. I'm sort of trying to make connections in the community. I want this project to be by the community for the community. So I want to just pause for a minute or two I've talked about a lot of different things and give you a little time to sort of reflect and digest. So I want to ask you some questions about what stereotypes have come to mind during this presentation of stereotypes that you might hold. Towards which groups or individuals do you think that you might have some prejudice towards? And that's a hard question to admit, but I challenge you to think about that. Have you ever acted in a way that fits the definition of discrimination? Once again, very hard to admit when we do that, but I encourage you to think about that. And how much do you want to change the beliefs and maybe some of the actions that have happened in the past? So I'm going to give everyone a minute to reflect on that and maybe take some notes. All right, I'm going to bring everyone back once again. I'm sorry I wasn't able to give everyone more time, but I would encourage you to start to have discussions, maybe with people in your workplace or other people in your life that you feel safe with, to begin to explore these things, because talking about it with other people makes us realize that we're not the only ones that might have trouble talking about this. Oh, could you share your website? Where? Yes, absolutely. On the last slide, I do have my website. So I'll be sure to share everyone my email and my website at the end. Okay, so I finally want to get to the point, in case you're sort of like, so this is what we think and this is how we act. Well, what are we supposed to do about that? So I want to leave you with some practical things according to psychology research that will help all of us try and change some of these processes. So I'm going to go over 5 different things one at a time about ways that we could start to change our biases. So number 1 is to use logic and data to override your emotions. So we talked about how prejudice is like a stereotype that has a negative emotion attached to it. So the problem is that a lot of stereotypes and prejudice, the emotions that tend to come up with those tend to be fear and anger. So if you kind of think about a group that you have a stereotype about, it might be that the stereotype makes you afraid of interacting with people or being with people in that particular group. So, or maybe you feel angry. Maybe there's stereotypes that this group is taking jobs of Americans, or that this group is a threat to me and my family. So when we get those emotions triggered, like fear and anger, oftentimes it's really hard to think rationally in a factual, logical type of way, because the emotional part of our brain kind of takes over. So in those moments, it can be really helpful to try and put a pause button on the emotion and say, okay, well, is this really true? Can I do any research? Are there any facts that could help me understand this better? So trying to remind ourselves that there might be facts or information out there that might counter this stereotype that we're thinking. So going back to schizophrenia, I asked you earlier on, what were some words that came to mind when you thought about schizophrenia? I'll say that schizophrenia in the media is often portrayed as something very dangerous. So oftentimes people on crime shows that are the criminals have schizophrenia, Whenever there's mass shootings, we often hear language about mental health around it. So what are some facts about mental health stereotypes that connect mental health with danger or criminality? So here are the facts. Only 3 to 5% of all crimes are committed by people with very serious mental health conditions. So that means that 95 to 97% of crimes have absolutely nothing to do with mental health. Only 7.5% of crimes are related to anything regarding mental health symptoms. And in fact, the stereotype is completely in reverse. So 1 in 4 people with a mental health disorder is likely to be the victim, not the perpetrator of a violent event. So that means people with mental health conditions are 4 times as likely to be vulnerable to being a victim. So taken together, this data shows that people with mental health conditions are more likely to be the victim of a crime than the perpetrator of a crime, which totally counters that stereotype. Okay, so we talked about using facts and logic. Try and do your own voices project. So interact with people in your outgroup. Now, this is not going to be easy because once again, we are psychologically programmed as humans to gravitate towards people that are similar to us. And honestly, there's probably an evolutionary reason. Like if you think back to caveman times, you wanted to stick with other humans and other people that were like you. So to do this, you're really going to have to make a deliberate effort to do this. So for those of you maybe who have a cafeteria in your workplace, what about one day for lunch? You literally just walk around the room and pick someone you don't know and sit next to them and get to know them. So that would be your own little voices project. So when you're interacting with someone in your outgroup, maybe there's some things that you want to look for. So maybe in this conversation, you figure out what do you have in common? Maybe you share a similar set of values, even though they have a totally different life from you. Maybe you'll learn about struggles that they're having. And maybe you can relate to those struggles, or maybe those struggles are very unique to who they are. And what can you learn from each other? So this will take some work on your part and challenge yourself. But if you use contact theory for yourself, then that's a really great way to build relationships with people that are different from you. Okay, I'm going to introduce you to my friend Joe. So Joe was interviewed. I'm going to stop sharing to show a little piece of the documentary. So let me see if I could get my technology to work. I think so. So Joe has schizophrenia, and he was interviewed as part of the Voices Project Mental Health. So I'm going to show you a little bit of Joe's story of what it's like to have schizophrenia. If anyone has trouble hearing, let me know.
7 days a week. I have not had a moment of silence inside of my head since December 2nd, 2010. Some of the audio hallucinations is just noise. Some of it is commands. Some of it is just talk. Some of it's positive. Some of it's negative. Some of the voices argue with each other and I think some of it's for my protection. It's weird. On the visual side, visually I see things coming out of holes. What I see is usually mechanical bug type of critters. I call them spiders, but they don't look anything like a spider. And usually they're metallic, and they have weapons with them. Most people don't believe that I have a mental illness when they first meet me and I disclose that I do. Just a real simple example, went to a foot doctor, gave a list of medication that I'm on because they were trying to think if they needed to do some medication for me. Asked what the medication was. I told him what it was for. His response, "You don't look like you're mentally ill." And I asked the question, what does mental illness look like? I lost almost all of my memory from extensive shock treatments. I was supposed to lose short-term memory, and I ended up losing a lot. And I found through social media from people that I went to school with and around the year that I graduated, I'm talking high school, they would be willing to give me memory back. They would tell me stories about myself. They would give me places that I could visit, and eventually I'm able to get some of the memories back.
You know, those kind of problems were hard for us.
I don't have a lot of fear through the community itself. I think when the community reacts that I have a mental illness, it gives me a chance to let people know that, okay, I'm a face of mental illness. I'm not the stereotype that you're seeing on the news or in movies or things like that. 70% of mentally ill in movies is depicted on the negative side. But the reality is only 4% of people that have mental illness are on the negative side of things.
Does the media do justice to mental disorders in general?
No. Plain and simple, no, they don't. And I think because of some of the times with my hallucinations, I have the media on all the time, whether it be movies, music, whatever. I need a noise fluctuation, and I developed a very, very strong liking to talk radio, because above and beyond music, talk, the fluctuations in talk help my voices. So I'm listening to local talk radio and national talk radio quite often. Now, the media does try their best to put the voice of mental illness out there. I've been interviewed for a local radio station before. But for the most part, the attitude is if something bad happens, they got to be mentally ill. And the media portrays it that way. I've even heard with the train accident that happened yesterday, mental illness might have been a factor. I've already heard that, and we don't even know why that train crashed, and yet I'm already hearing that.
So, you know, the mental changes still to.
All right, so you got to meet Joe, my friend Joe. And now you have met someone with schizophrenia. And what's really interesting about Joe is that Joe was interviewed for the Voices Project Mental Health. And then he's part of NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and there's a Wilkes-Barre chapter and Grand chapter of NAMI. And so I asked NAMI to have a table outside of the theatrical production so that anyone who wanted support or help with mental illness could speak with Joe at the NAMI table. And Joe picks four-leaf clovers because when he picks four-leaf clovers, his mind is able to relax from the voices that he hears. And so what he was doing was giving out four-leaf clovers to everybody. He has like hundreds of them, thousands of them. So he gives them out whenever he meets people. And so I have a four-leaf clover in my house, so I always think of Joe. All right, so the other thing that we could do is commit to egalitarianism. And that's a really fancy word for what most of us probably believe and want, which is the idea that all people are equal and deserve equal rights and opportunities. So most of us see ourselves as egalitarian people, that we are people that do really want equity and equality in society. So how committed are we to making that happen? All of you who are here today and are listening, I'm assuming you are very committed to that because you're going to this training or these trainings and trying to learn how to be more egalitarian or make that happen. So this is more for reflection. If we had more time, maybe I'd sort of have us talk about it. So can we examine how much we actually do egalitarian actions? So let's say you're hanging out with your friends and one of them makes a racist joke. So what do you do? So once again, this is a reflection. Are you actually going to say, guys, that's not funny, don't say that? Or is it just kind of like, well, I'm not going to laugh, but I'm just going to let it pass. You overhear a coworker talk about how Muslims are violent and can't be trusted. What do you do? So it might depend on if that's your belief also. So if that's your belief, you might join in on a conversation about that. If that's not your belief, you might feel uncomfortable about it, but you might think, well, I don't really know any Muslims, so I'm not really going to like take a stand against this. Or would you say that's not true? Like Muslims are very peaceful people. That's not cool to say that. And you're a manager at a company and notice that one of your employees, a woman, is being paid less than another employee who's a man for doing the exact same job. What do you do? So once again, we can kind of think about the difference between egalitarian intentions of that is who I want to be, but am I fully acting that way? So am I taking the uncomfortable, challenging step to make life better for other people, even if it is very uncomfortable for me to do that? So I'm going to ask, what is one time you behaved in a manner that violated your own egalitarian beliefs? So what's one time that you acted in a way that did not support the egalitarian idea of wanting equality and equity? So it could be something where you didn't stand up for somebody in an opportunity that maybe you now wish that you had. It could be preferring and giving preference to one group over another group. So there could be a lot of different ways that this happens. So what made you act that way? So once you identify a situation where that happened, you could think, well, what was going on in that situation? Why I did that or why I didn't do something that I wanted to do. And reflecting on this is probably going to make you feel very uncomfortable in terms of you might feel guilty that you didn't do something, or maybe even ashamed that you didn't do something. So what I would say is that those feelings that come up of feeling ashamed or guilty or whatever feeling might come up for you can help you, motivate you to act in egalitarian ways. So how did you feel writing that down, or how did you feel thinking about that? We know how we ought to behave to help others, but sometimes we just don't act that way. So this idea of feeling uncomfortable about our biases is actually very motivating. It makes us want to be better and want to do better. So use and channel that to try and encourage you to act egalitarian as much as possible in the future. And finally, take control of your biases. So now that you guys have been through this training, you now are more aware of how your mind works, why we have stereotypes and prejudice, and what we could do about it. So once you are more aware of it, that's when you are empowered and you can begin to notice and control it and minimize its influence on your behavior. So if you're able to say, whoa, that was a stereotype, why was I thinking that? That is such a huge step to being able to control it. So I am now going to task all of you and give you the responsibility to try and take control of your mind and your stereotypes and your biases. Not that it's easy, but to just commit to trying to go down the pathway of trying to do that. So for those of you who want to learn more, and for those of you who like podcasts, the Hidden Brain podcast on NPR is fantastic. It's about all kinds of psychology, lots of intersections with psychology in the workplace as well. So I have embedded links to 3 of the podcasts in this PowerPoint. And then I've also given you some other books that you could read if you're really interested in learning more about deconstructing privilege and biases and stereotypes and prejudice. Okay, so here's my email. Here is my website. My website has all the videos of the Voices Project Disability, the Voices Project Mental Health. It has a TED Talk that I gave, an NPR podcast that's on there. It also has all of the materials to do the Voices Project. So if you are at all interested in doing any kind of version of this framework, feel free to contact me. I've had people in other colleges do the Voices Project and adjust it to the needs of their populations. So I'm always happy to work with anybody who wants to do that. Or if you just have any questions or anything that I can tell you about or extend our conversation, feel free to let me know. So I will leave this up here for another minute or so. 12:54. I'm so excited that I know I talk fast, that I got in here before everyone has a 1 o'clock meeting. But if you would like to stay and talk with me, ask any questions, I'm going to hang around for a little while, and feel free to email me as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alicia. This was a great presentation. Didn't even realize something like this existed in our backyard, so really excited for that. Can everybody hear me? And thank you everybody who spent their lunch hour with us. We did record the session. Will be available on our Facebook and YouTube pages within a couple days. We encourage you to visit our event page to register for the other sessions that are going on. We have 7 more sessions. This was the first one. And share information with anyone that can benefit from the content. We also have the Greater Wyoming Valley Chamber Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council. If anybody's interested in more information on that, that's on our Get Involved page on our website. But at this time, does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask Alicia?
This happens in my classes too. Everyone's like, I don't want to be the first one to talk. You can also feel free to put it in the chat if you guys prefer to type. I put my email and my website in the chat also.
Alicia, I have a quick question for you. Do you have any suggestions if you're leading a team and you want to build inclusiveness with your team? Do you have any quick team building suggestions around the topic that you would suggest for a manager to do with their team?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm co-editing this book that's coming out on stigma and discrimination reduction programs, and there's a chapter about like a kind of a training, how to do anti-bias training, because there's some ways that you can do it that actually increases bias as opposed to decreasing bias. So it's very, very tricky work. And I think it's helpful to have a model to use. So if anyone's interested in materials, I'm happy to share materials with you for the workplace. I would say a safe route to take would be to talk about identity in general. So I'm happy to share any handouts or activities. So I like to start with a conversation of who am I? Like, what is my gender? What's my age, my race, mental health, physical disability? Like, you kind of go through all the diversity categories for yourself. And then you begin to talk about which of these aspects do I show? Which of these aspects do I hide? Why do I show them? Why do I hide them? And then that could actually lead into a conversation about what stereotypes might people have about me. And that's often a way to get people eased into this idea of identifying then what stereotypes might I have about other people. And in a workplace, it might be helpful to say, well, who are our customers? What are their identities? And what are ways that I might not know a lot about that identity, or I might be misjudging that identity? So that might be kind of a series of exercises that might help. The team building would kind of be the what's my identity and sharing that with other people. And then that kind of eases you into looking outward from yourself.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Well, for anybody who did pre-register, we will be sending the PowerPoint and video recording, and it will appear on our Facebook and YouTube pages, so be sure to check out them. And our next session is on Thursday at noon, along with the full lineup. So please check out our full lineup for this month, April's Diversity Month. So we're excited to do this webinar series and keep it going. So thank everybody for joining again, and have a good rest of your afternoon.